Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. Now this video is going to be slightly different, and that's simply because while it is a recap of the Dark Ages Vampire Chronicle that I've been running, it has been quite some time since I last recapped one of those sessions. Therefore, a fair amount of time has elapsed, a number of sessions have elapsed, and it will be easiest for me to recap each character's perspective. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of the players in some regard here, so apologies to the players if I take any liberties with their characters, but this is going to be the easiest way to get you up to speed on where we are so far. So let's start with Coraline, our La Sombra, who is currently building her herd, as well as waiting for her betrothed, the Tremere Jerome, to return from the British Isles, having slain a werewolf, gained its pelt, and protected her holdings in Wisbeck, all within 7 days. That was the task that she set him to, and in order to win her heart in the courts of love and indulge in all the pageantry that follows. Unfortunately for Coraline, night went by, after night, after night, after night. And while her herd increased in size, as Gwyneth was able to recruit a new one, Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. This video is going to be slightly different in setup. While it's still going to be a Dark Ages Vampire Chronicle recap, it has been quite some time since the last time I recapped one of these sessions. Therefore, due to the time that's elapsed, the number of sessions that have taken place, what I'm going to do is instead tell you the story so far for each character, starting with the Lady Coraline. Coraline, our La Sombra, currently in Chartres, who is building her herd and also waiting for her betrothed, the Tremere Jerome, to return from the British Isles, where she sent him to slay a werewolf and protect her holdings in Wisbeck. It was a tall order, but it was something that the knight, Jerome, took in his stride. He puffed out his chest, he said that he would do it, and so he disappeared off into the night. In the time that elapsed whilst Coraline was waiting for Jerome to return, her ever-growing herd, currently comprising of Edward and Gwyneth, Gwyneth being her retainer and Edward being her vessel. The reason for why being Gwyneth is afflicted with a scrofula, and therefore she doesn't want to risk drinking from her, so while she will feed Gwyneth blood, she will drink from Edward, making a lovely little cycle of life. And they are a married couple as well, Edward and Gwyneth. Gwyneth, seeing her mistress, Coraline, as a goddess of a sort, a deity, and knowing something of Coraline's past, knowing that at one point she was a nun, a badly abused nun, as many were, someone who certainly didn't find much faith in the convent or love, recognised a kindred spirit, or so she thought, in a girl that had made a pilgrimage to Chartres, had fallen afoul of the convent there, been taken in by the nuns, horrifically abused. This girl, Meredith, Gwyneth had liberated from the clutches of the convent and brought to, well, face to face with Coraline as she awoke one night and said, "I have brought you another servant, another one who wished to see the light, and she mirrors your own story so well. She has likewise been brutalised by the nuns. She has also had her faith tortured. Show her the true light, show her your power." Now, Coraline was presented with something of a quandary. She is still on the road of humanity, and therefore it's not like she could just cast this vessel to the stones and say, "And that's what happens when you reveal my true nature." Instead, she took pity on Meredith, and recognising a sort of kindred spirit, likewise fed her blood. Meredith was afflicted with the pox, and once again Coraline didn't wish to risk feeding from someone who was so openly diseased, not knowing what the outcome would be. Sylvanus has made various allusions to vampires that carry diseases with them, and so Coraline wishes to keep her palate clean. So there are now 2 retainers and 1 vessel in Caroline's herd, and so it gets increasingly large and increasingly difficult to maintain. It's something Caroline is going to have to think on as the chronicle goes on. But before she could think about it in too much depth, the returning hero, on the final night before Isoudre de Blay, the Queen of the Court of Love in Chartres, called an end to the pageantry for this season, Jerome returned. Alas, he was without werewolf pelt. And alas, he didn't even have a scratch on him, which struck Caroline as quite strange. And yet Jerome told her, yes, he had been to the British Isles, yes, he had slain a werewolf, but alas, it had transformed into human form after killing, and so he couldn't just carry a human skin around with him. And he had secured her holdings in Wisbech. He knew a surprising amount about the British Isles, and while his story checked out to some degree, Caroline had her doubts about him. In fact, she got one of the members of the coterie to examine him, to see whether he was telling the truth, quite surreptitiously. You see, both Ulrich and Cheyenne have auspex, the ability to see the souls of others and detect deception. Bizarrely, what they saw when they looked at Jerome was a grey slate. Nothing there at all. Just complete obfuscation, you could say. Everything about him was a lie. So where did they begin, those lies? It was impossible for Caroline to know, having only known Jerome for the last week. But certainly everything he was saying, he seemed to be saying truthfully. Everything he seemed to be doing, none of it seemed to be harming her, and she did need his hand, essentially, in marriage in order to get to Paris and gain an audience with Prince Alexander. So she went along with the ruse. She congratulated him for his bravery, and when preparing to share the blood, they did so, and Caroline discovered something quite fascinating. Now, this is something that I've had noted in my storyteller's notes for some time. It's a merit that Caroline has, but she hadn't realised that she possessed. She is unbondable. It's a merit I very rarely roll out in games of vampire because it can be easily abused, but I thought it spoke truly to this particular La Sombre. She has bucked off her possessive sire, she doesn't believe in the authority of the church, and perhaps her blood is stronger than she believes, and therefore she is unbondable. Now, Jerome did not know this. He drank of her, she drank of him, and when they went to the bedding ceremony, Jerome declined. He expressed that when he was indoctrinated into the house of Tremere, he was castrated and therefore would not be able to participate in the bedding. Caroline was okay with this. She accepted it. She did not judge him for it. She had plenty of other things to judge him for. And so their love was, union was agreed upon by Isoudre de Blay, who is completely oblivious, it would seem, to Jerome's subterfuge. And they made their way to Paris. Now, the other characters, before we get onto the Paris section. Ulrich shares something with Caroline in the fact that his number of retainers are also increasing. He was on the path of achieving various deadly sins, fulfilling them, shall we say, without succumbing to them. That was the task that Osanna, the follower of Typhon, had set for him. That to win her heart he would have to indulge in every one of the Christian sins without succumbing, without it forever changing him. So he indulged, and over the next few nights he indulged in the sin of, let's think, there was envy, as he noticed that Sven was spending a lot of time, Sven being his ghoul, was spending an awful lot of time with a slightly effeminate male, who Sven explained was a killer, a cutthroat and cutpurse, who would make for a fine member of Ulrich's retainers, the blooded men. So she grew envious at the amount of time Sven was spending with this man, Gainotin. Ulrich indulged in his lust with Sven. If I ever refer to Ulrich as a she, it's because the player is a lady, and I occasionally just refer to the player's gender instead. But Ulrich also indulged in his lust with Sven. Having enjoyed the explosion of, well, grief outpouring, passions and whatnot on the riverbank the nights before, Ulrich decided to indulge in them once again, and therefore exhibited his lust with Sven. And this just left pride. Now, seeing Gainotin and Sven spending so much time together, and worried that Gainotin and Sven may actually be collaborating against Ulrich, Ulrich ambushed Gainotin just as he was getting a sword forged, or picking one up from the blacksmith. And Ulrich overpowered Gainotin with his proficiency for domination. Ulrich fed Gainotin his blood as well, his vitae, and in so doing exerted a small measure of pride. Ulrich for the last 6 nights has been somewhat whittled down, has been belittled, has been weakened by these tasks, but feeling proud again, feeling on top, feeling able to be the top dog, was enough to make Ulrich fulfill the sin of pride. Now, these various encounters had various effects on Ulrich's rating on the Road of Kings. Notably, it shot down, but importantly, it was not whittled down to 3 or less. That was the marker that I had in my storyteller notes, and this meant that he retained most of who he was, and when he returned to Osanna, she was elated. He was able to indulge in all of these things without it corrupting him completely. This was the kind of male she was after, and so they indulged in the blood and in the flesh, and their union was also agreed upon, consecrated, shall we say, by Isolde de Blay. Now this just left Cheyenne. Cheyenne and Philippe le Bleu, and if you may recall with Philippe le Bleu, he was a religious fanatic who would scorch out his eyes every single morning. And this was not a task that Cheyenne particularly wished to share in. She expressed this to him, and unfortunately due to some rather catastrophic roles, she did not persuade him that this was something acceptable. He would not accept her unless she was likewise willing to score her eyes out and blind herself to the beauty of God's creation. She is on the road of sin, admittedly, but she doesn't advertise the fact, and the fact that Philippe le Bleu is so ardently on the road of heaven, quite evangelical in its path, well, they aren't a match made in heaven, shall we say. Now, with this being the case, they kind of formed an impasse. The two of them weren't getting anywhere in their relationship. Neither of them was particularly prepared to make the next step and consecrate it in the flesh and the blood. Well, they'd already consecrated the flesh part, but they hadn't shared the blood. And this meant that Cheyenne was a little listless. She went back to the brothel that Osanna had taken her to previously, where she had orgasmed for the first time, a really good one since her death, and that had connected her to her humanity very briefly. And she went back to this brothel and spoke to the male prostitute that she had spent time with before, and invited him, said, "Will you be my husband? Will you accompany me to Paris? I can offer you the world, I can offer you immortality." And quite frankly, he said no. He appreciated her offer, he was very flattered by it, and she was a beautiful woman, but he had everything he required in Chartres. He serviced the priesthood, he serviced anyone noble. The reason he had silk sheets on his bed is because he was a very proficient, prolific, and, well, successful male prostitute. He did not see his job as something demeaning or something to be thrown off, and he certainly didn't wish to better himself and subsist only off of blood and lose most of what made up his life and in the pleasures of the flesh. And Cheyenne, in fairness to her, could respect that, and so she didn't embrace him, she didn't ghoul him. Instead, she went to the Hall of Fools, where the other unions were being consecrated, without Philippe. Philippe did show up, but only to strike her about the face and accuse her of attempting to cuckold him by spending time with a mortal prostitute. He had found out about this, and he stormed out in front of the rest of the court. This led to many calling him a brute, and all taking her side in the matter. After all, vampires can feed from whomever they so choose, but it did leave her without a partner. There was still the option of partnering with a Cathar that was in Chartres, but Cheyenne wasn't mad. She wasn't going to take a Cathar husband to very Catholic Paris. And so they left, three of them, with two partners, being Jerome and Hosanna, and they headed towards Paris. It was on the road to Paris that they came upon a farmhouse. Now, there were plenty of Cainites on this road. It was like a bunch of moths being drawn to a flame. Something was drawing these vampires to Paris, and it could only be mused on that it was possibly the power of Prince Alexander. When he indulges in the courts of love and the pageantry and the romance and the passions, then he essentially, well, how shall we put this, exerts his sheer majesty on all Cainites surrounding Paris, and all who have felt the touch of love, the pleasures of the flesh and the blood, would make the pilgrimage to Paris to see him, so that he could either judge their relationship worthy or unworthy. So there were no few Cainites on the road, and the coterie came across two in a farmhouse attacking a farmer and his wife. These two, the bombastic, large, grotesque in some ways, Bastides, and his brother Louis d'Alichamp, who was quite the opposite in his slight look, his quiet behaviour, his speaking through gritted teeth, were monstrous. They were being horrendous to this farmer's wife, and Caroline seemed all ready to object, but instead, when Bastides and Louis saw the coterie, they flipped a coin. Bastides seemed to win, and he approached the group, and speaking in a booming voice, he inquired, were they en route to Paris? They explained that they were. He explained his tragic tale. He was an actor, a dramatist, a great love of the arts, and yet he could not find a bride. They had travelled north from the south of France, and nowhere had Louis nor Bastides been able to find a suitable vampiric bride. Now, it just so happened that Cheyenne, who in parting from Chartres had left her sire Raoul with a gross slight, it should be noted, was in the possession of an open, charter from Chartres that allowed her to potentially marry any vampires that she should fall in love with at first sight on the road. And that it was signed already by Azudi de Blay, who didn't take these things terribly seriously, so that she could still gain admittance to Paris, although at a slightly lower ranked marital status, shall we say. This marriage would not be recognised as well as one that had actually been shown to Azudi de Blay. Anyway, she had this blank cheque, and Bastides explained that he had no wife to take to Paris, and Louis had agreed to take this farmer's wife and embrace her after having his wicked way with her. So Bastides fell to his knees and pledged his love, his head-over-heels love, his love at first sight for Cheyenne. Cheyenne, being not desperate, but at something of a loss, she didn't have a partner to take to Paris, agreed to Bastides' proposal, and the coterie, gathering together, did make the observation: an actor in their coterie could actually come in great use. If you recall the play that they intend to put on, humiliating the Bruja, and therefore triggering a war between the city-states to the south and the courts of love to the north. Now that is where this recap shall end, as the coterie made their way to Paris, and if I have missed anything out from Chartres or the road to Paris, then I invite the players to correct me in the comments below. I will endeavour to make the Paris recap my next recording. Thank you very much for watching.